Sophie, and tonight we're going to be looking at civil rights that remain unprotected or in jeopardy, either through law or in practice, in Australia today. Civil rights are defined as the rights of citizens granted by law to receive equal treatment regardless of race, gender, national origin, disability or other grounds. They are distinguishable from human rights in that they are granted by the state, rather than belonging fundamentally to all humans. The very nature of a civil right thus ascertains that they are enforced through national law. However, Australia is also actually the only Western democracy without a specific Bill of Rights dedicated to their protection, a result of late 19th century politicians wishing to deny Indigenous Australians and Asian workers their rights. This instead means that civil rights are enforced by parliamentarians and generally throughout the Constitution, general law and legislation. Now getting to the point, one of the more active groups of Australians whose civil rights are to some extent unprotected are people in the LGBT community. Discrimination through homophobic verbal abuse is experienced by 60% of homosexual Australians, and LGBT anti-discrimination laws are unenforceable in our religious schools and hospitals. The right to equal protection under the law without discrimination is also often unprotected. For example, in an inquiry made by the AHRC, it was revealed that same-sex couples and their children do not receive the same financial and work-related entitlements as other Australians. Another unprotected and rather topical civil right is that of same-sex marriage, which despite gaining growing support has been argued by those opposed to it to not actually classify as marriage and therefore not be a civil right. Indigenous Australians are also denied certain civil rights today, as despite significant gains since the movements of the late 1950s onwards, there still exist many inequalities. In terms of the rights to equal opportunities and equal treatment under law, Indigenous Australians have disproportionately high levels of illiteracy, unemployment, disabilities, lack of healthcare, domestic violence and child removal. Despite making up only 3% of the Australian population, they contribute to 27% of our prison population, and the abuse of Aboriginal youths in Northern Australian and Queensland detention centres has come to light in previous years. This all reflects on unsuccessful government policies, and as the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People, Ms. Tauli Karpuz, puts it, while the country has adopted numerous policies to address the socio-economic disadvantage of Indigenous Australians, it has failed to respect their rights of self-determination and failed to deliver on targets. The push by Indigenous Australians for constitutional recognition has also grown in recent years. The unprotected rights of asylum seekers fleeing to Australia are also a prominent and heavily debated issue. The president of ALHR states that the protection of human rights is now at a very low point in human history with relation to a surge in the number of people seeking asylum. The mandatory indefinite detainment of people in closed immigration detention with limited access to Australian courts violates in many cases the right to seek and enjoy asylum from prosecution, freedom from arbitrary detention, and right to challenging their detention in court. The reports of inhumane treatment, while more on the side of human rights, also raise concern for basic civil rights such as the right to safety. However, when criticising policies and suggesting alternatives, we must also bear in mind national border security and domestic economic concerns. Other groups whose civil rights remain unprotected or are in jeopardy in Australia include women, who still face up to a 35% pay gap and high levels of domestic violence. Disabled people also encounter denial of civil rights, with non-therapeutic sterilisation, barriers to voting in secrecy, and other legal, economic and social discrimination, denying, for example, the rights to equal protection under law, the right to safety and the right to vote. The right to vote is also not given to anyone serving a prison sentence of 3 years or longer, which is debated as to whether it fits the United Nations objective and reasonable criteria which would deem it a non-violation. On another note, there are also growing concerns of counter-terrorism legislation in its threat towards civil rights. Over 50 new anti-terrorism laws have been passed since the 9/11 attacks in 2001, And as the president of the HREOC says, too often counter-terrorism laws have been developed without properly considering the potential human rights implications. Some of the more concerning laws grant police extended powers to detain and to stop, question and search people, and to obtain control orders. Powers are also given to ASIO to detain any persons, even if not suspected of terrorist offences. Such legislation infringes on the civil right to liberty, freedom from arbitrary detention, and freedom of movement, to name a few. Another side effect of such legislation is on Muslim and Arab communities and their right to security and non-discrimination, as according to the PJCIS, they have experienced a rise in prejudicial feelings and alienation attributed to the new anti-terrorist measures. So while it is true that many civil rights are protected in Australia today, it should be remembered that there are still some groups who are not lawfully granted or who have not in reality received their rights as a citizen, and that some civil rights are in jeopardy for Australians in general. We should remember that for our democracy to succeed, we must first ensure that everybody receives the rights that they are promised. That's all from me. Have a nice evening.